Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're well. Today is Wednesday. It is the 31st of January, and we're getting ready for Parshas Yisro. It's Rabbi Akiva Males, and if I sound a little congested, I'm sorry. I'm on antibiotics. I'm on the mend, but I'm here. That's what's important. So, we're feeling much better. So here we go. I want to share with you today 3 Divrei Torah on Parshas Yisro. I think each one of them is very special. I don't know how to rank them, which one's more special than the other, but each one of them are very good. So let's jump right in. I'm just going to make a bracha. Okay, so we're going to jump right in. Right at the beginning of the Parsha. So remember, Yisro is the father of Tzipporah. This is Moshe's father-in-law. And we're told at the beginning of the Parsha that he has heard all that has happened with Am Yisrael after they have left Mitzrayim and they've left Egypt. They've come into the wilderness and he wants to join them. We're going to see there's a dispute amongst our Tanaim, going back to the time of the Gemara and in the Midrash. When exactly was it that Yisro showed up? There's some discussion. So let's see. Rashi quotes some of it, but we're going to see the Gemara, which it's also a Medrash that quotes, there are actually more opinions. So let's see the first pasuk in the Parsha. Vayishma Yisro Kohen Midyan Chosein Moshe as Kol Asher Asa Elokim LeMoshe Yisrael Amo. That Yisro, who was a chief of Midyan, at one point he was an idolatrous priest. He had given that up. He has heard he's the father-in-law of Moshe. He's heard about all the wonderful things that God has done for Moshe and the Jewish people. Everything that surrounds the story of the Exodus, everything that relates to the whole episode of the Jewish people leaving Egypt. Now, you'll see that the sages start to discuss, well, what was it specifically that really got to him? What was it that really moved him? True, he heard everything, but what was it specifically that moved him? And you'll see there's different opinions by our sages. So here I have a quoted from the Torah Tamima. That's the Chumash, the commentary of Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein. Remember, what he does is he brings down on the psukim as much as he can. He wants to bring down what is Torah Sheba'al Peh, what does our oral tradition have to say about the psukim in Torah Shebachsav, and then he has a commentary on the bottom. So this is just a quote. I just went to him because he's quoting this Gemara in Zvachim, but it's also Midrashim that say this as well. You'll see here at least 3 opinions. Vayishma Yisro, Mashmu Shama Uba Viniskayer. What specifically was it? What aspect of the entire Exodus story was it that Yisro heard that really moved him and inspired him to leave his position of comfort back in Midyan and to come and to join and to convert and become a member of Am Yisrael, to throw his lot with the Jewish people? First opinion, Rabbi Yeshua Omer Melchemes Amalek Shama. He heard about the war against Amalek, that Amalek attacks the Jewish people right as they're leaving Egypt. That was the end of last week's Parsha. That's the juxtaposition. Last week's Parsha B'Shalach ended with the surprise attack of Amalek. Yeshua leads an army that vanquishes them. Immediately after that, you find Vayishma Yisro. So that's what he says. Based on the juxtaposition, that's what he had heard. Sharek Sivitzido, what was right before this, meaning at its side, what was right before this? That Yeshua vanquished the nation of Amalek and all of its warriors, its people, by his sword. Okay, that's the first opinion. Rav Elazar Modai Omer, what is it that he heard? Matan Torah Shamabo. He heard about the fact that the Jewish people had received the Torah. Now, all the commentators to this point out, according to this opinion, we have this concept that the Torah is not always written in order. This would be a classic example of this, because at this point, we haven't read about the Torah being given yet, right? The Torah is going to be given later in this week's Parsha, and I think it's Shishi, where that takes place, the 6th Aliyah. So here's the very first opening words of the Psukim. So you have to say, according to this opinion, that what he heard about was Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. That would come out that this is written out of order. Okay, Matan Torah Shema Abba, he heard about the giving of the Torah. Shekeshenitna Torah lamo Yisrael, because when the Torah was given to the Jewish people, hayakolo holech misofa lamat sofa. The sound was so tremendous. There were the reverberations of it, whether it was the lightning and the thunder, or just the incredible fire and light show that was going on. Sounds of this, or just maybe it was the word spread. Everybody in the world heard about the giving of the Torah. That made such an impression on him. That's what made him join. Third opinion, Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Kriyas Yam Suf Shama Ba. You heard about the splitting of the sea, this incredible miracle. Shenemar, it says in Yoshua, Vayikishma kol malchei Amori, that what is the same word, that here it says Vayishma Yisro. So in Sefer Yoshua, it also uses that same expression that when all the natives in Canaan, when they heard about, when they heard about the fact how God had dried up the Jordan River and split it so the Jewish people could pass through, that hearing about that made this incredible impact on them. So that same expression about hearing makes this incredible impression. That's how he learns this. It uses the same word Vayishma as over there. So over there it had to do with the miracle of a splitting of a river, which was the Jordan. So here when it says Vayishma, it must mean what you heard about the miracle of a splitting of a body of water. It must be about the splitting of the sea. So there's three opinions. Okay. Now, let's take a look at, here's a sefer that we've quoted a couple times over the past year. Rabbi Shlomo Margolis, he was a student of the Navardic yeshivas in Europe before the Holocaust, survived, he made it to America, he lived in Boston for many years. He was a rabbi of a shul called the the Chayei Adam, rather, the Chayei Adam shul. And that was in Boston, and at the end of his life, he moved to Israel, and he wrote some svarim there and passed away. So Rabbi Shlomo Margolis, what the sefer he wrote was Darkei HaShlemos. It's really on the parsha, but it gives us an insight into perhaps what may a Navardic opinion have been, because he was a true student of Navardic, so it can sometimes help us get an insight into the way of what was someone who was reared and raised in the Torah, in the school of Navardic. How did they view the Parshios? I'd like to think that this could offer some insight into this lost world of Navardic, and because he was so influenced by all of his teachers in that yeshiva. So let's see what he has on this. Vayishma Yisro. So he's going on the opinion that Rav Elazar Amodai, who said it was that he heard Matan Torah, that what really impressed Yisro was the fact that the Jews had received the Torah. So he wants to interpret this a little. Rav Elazar Amodai Omer Matan Torah Shamalva. He heard about the giving of the Torah, and that's what caused him to join the Jewish people. Lanias Daiti, so Rabbi Margolis writes, Lanias Daiti, Eina Kavan Lomar, Sheis Orer Achvarak Meya Inyan. I'm sorry, let me scroll down on the screen here. I didn't do that for people online. I'm sorry. He says, Rabbi Elazar Modai Omer Matan Torah Shomava, Lanias Daiti, the way I see it, Eina Kavan Lomar, Sheis Orer Achvarak Meya Inyan, Aniskav Shamatan Torah Meya Kodesh Baruch Lam Segulaso. When Rav Elazar Amodai said that what really impacted Yisro was the fact that God gave him the Torah, he doesn't just mean the fact that God shared his lofty Torah from the heavens and shared it with his treasured nation. It's not just that simple. Yitaken Lomar, he says, I would suggest it's a little bit more complex than that. Yitaken Lomar, Shamabat Shalo Va'odo Nachri Hayal Kach. While he was still a Gentile, meaning while he was still a Gentile, he viewed what the rest of the world viewed, that the Jews had received the Torah, and here was the way he saw things. Shebizman she'ein lehem shum karka v'territoria, he looks at the Jewish people, and he says, look at them, look at their lot in life right now. They're wandering in the wilderness. They don't have a land of their own. They don't have territory with borders of their own. Ein lam parnasa misuderes v'shar tzrachim. They don't have a set way to earn a living yet, and they don't have a way to ensure that all their needs are met. And still, what did they do? V'hem mekabel Torah. And what did they do? Not just that God gave them the Torah, but they accepted a Torah. They accepted a system of regulations of how to run their lives. Hey, mekabel Torah. Look at these people. They were willing to accept all these regulations and rules to govern their lives. Torah's Chayim, it's a living Torah that governs a daily life. At every station of life. If you look at the world around us, and no nation acts that way. Kodem, the first thing that any nation does, miyasdim medina, establish a nation, a country with borders, imshara dvarim anilvim, with everything else that a country needs. You've got borders, you've got your sources of water, you've got your sources of food, you've got all that. Virak acherkach, only once those basic needs are set, that people have a land, they've got borders, they've got a place to live. Okay, once that's all in place, then misaknim chukim. Now let's get about the business of setting up laws and regulations and some kind of system that's going to govern everything. That's the way the rest of the world operates. But what did the Jewish people do? The exact opposite. Before they even start to set up a land, before they have borders, before they've got a way to make a living, what do? We're going to regulate the way we live our lives. This is what blew Yisro's mind. It wasn't the fact that God chose to give his Torah to the Jewish people. Yeah, that's impressive. But that's not really what got to Yisro. What Rav Elazar Amodai meant, what really shook Yisro to the core, is look at Am Yisrael. It's not that God gave them the Torah. The fact that Am Yisrael accepted the Torah, they were willing to set up all these structures to their lives before they've got the basic building blocks of a society. Shein Am Yisrael misakenes chukav al pi achayim. It's not that the Jewish people established laws based on the life that they already have. To the contrary, they said, we're going to establish our nation and our national identity based on the laws. That's the opposite that everybody else has. Everybody else has a nation, has an identity, and now let's set up a system of laws. They say, no, God's got a system of laws. Terrific. Let's hear that law. Let's accept it. And based on those laws, we'll set up our life. We'll set up our society. That's what blew his mind, Uvav and Iskayer. And that's what caused him to say, I'm throwing my lot. This is a special people, and I want to join them. And he throws his lot with Am Yisrael, and he becomes a righteous convert. I thought that's just a very interesting way to look at things, and I'm not sure that I ever fully appreciated that. We focus on the fact that, okay, Bnei Yisrael said Nasev and Ishma. And I always focus on the fact that what did that mean? That they said, okay, we'll accept it in ourselves and then we'll find out what it is. This unbelievable act of trust. And that is an incredible act of trust for the Jewish people to accept that we're going to live our lives in governance according to God's set of rules before we even know what those rules are. That's incredible. But I think where Margolis is adding is there's another aspect to Nasav and Ishma. What's so impressive about Nasav and Ishma is we accepted these regulations before we even have a society. And he said, and we basically, our ancestors said, based on those rules, that's how we'll establish our society. We're not going to establish our rules based on our society. To the contrary, we'll accept the rules because they're coming from the lawgiver, they're coming from God himself. And based on those rules, that's how we'll set up society. That's in a completely different way. There's no nation in the world that operates that way, that first sets up a set of rules and say, okay, now let's go find a country to live in and implement all those laws. Nobody does that. They first have a land and then they figure out, okay, well, what do we got to do to make sure that things are going to work properly and things are going to operate as they should. And here's Bnei Yisrael doing completely opposite. First, let's set up a legal system. We got it? Good. Now, based on that legal system, let's build a society. That's a completely different way to look at things. And it never really struck me before, just how different that was and what was really entailed when we said Nasav and Ishma. I thought that struck me. I want to share with you a second point. A little bit later in the Parsha, we're on page 2 now. On page 2, we're going to see just a few psukim later. Vayavo Yisro Chosein Moshe. Yisro, who's the father-in-law of Moshe, so he approaches. Uvanav Ishto al Moshe. And he's got together with him, he's got Moshe's wife Tzipporah and the 2 sons, and he approaches the Jewish camp. He approaches Moshe al Midbar, Sheruchona Shamar Elokim, and they approach Moshe and the Jewish people. They're camped around Har Sinai. Vayomer al Moshe ani chosem cha Yisro ba'elacha. I'm your father-in-law, Yisro. I'm coming to see you. Vishtacha Shneim V'na'ima. And I've got your wife with you, and your 2 sons are with her. So let us in. We want to see you. We've got all these people want to have a reunion. Zion 7. No, Moshe goes out to greet his father-in-law. They kiss one another. He bows down and he kisses him. And then one man asks the other man, one greeted the other, and says, "How are you doing? Are you at peace?" And after that, they enter the tent. One more pasuk ches. Moshe tells his father-in-law everything that God has done to Paro and to his nation Egypt, Alodos Yisrael, on account of the Jewish people. And he also tells them about all the hardships that befell them on the road, on the way, and how the Lord saved them. Okay, pasuk Zion is a little mysterious. Pasuk Zion said, again, let's look at it. 7. Moshe went out to greet his father-in-law. He bows down and he kisses him. So it's kind of clear at this point who's doing what. Moshe's doing the bowing, Moshe's doing the kissing. And then it says, Vayishalu and they asked one another, Ish l'reu, one man asks his friend, L'shalom, about how their peace is. Let's see what this Be'er Yosef. We've quoted the Be'er Yosef before. I think over the last year or two is when I became aware of him. This was Rav Yosef Salant, descendant of the famous Rav Shmuel Salant of Yerushalayim, and he passed away within the past several decades. Apparently, he was a very famous orator in Yerushalayim, and much of his material has been written up on the Parsha. So let's see what he does here. On this pasuk, he quotes a Mechilta, that's one of the Midrashim, and Rashi makes use of this Mechilta, but he says, let's look at the Mechilta in its original. He says, B'Mechilta v'huva b'Rashi, but Kitzur Rashi abridged it. It says, Vayishtachu vayishaklo. They bowed down, and he kissed him. Eini yodea mi yishtach elami. It's not really clear from the pasuk who was the first one to bow down, umi nashak umi. Who kissed who? Kishu Omar, but then when it says, V'yishalu ish l'reyeyu, that one man asks his friend, so now it all becomes clear. Mi karai ish, who in the Torah is referred to as ish? Hello Moshe, that's Moshe. Shenamar, next page, we're going to topic 3. Because the Torah says, Va'ish Moshe and Sefer Bamidbar, when Miriam and Aaron spoke poorly about Moshe, God says, Va'ish Moshe anav mikol adam. That Moshe, the ish Moshe, the man Moshe, was the anav mikol adam. He was the most humble person out there. Havi Omer, so if it says ish, one ish asked the other who it was, so that means, okay, Moshe is the initiator. So Havi Omer, so that tells me, lo ishtach havev lo nashak ela Moshe l'chamav. That means in this pasuk, the person who's doing all the initiating, who's the one who initiates the bowing, who initiates the kissing, who initiates the asking, how you doing? It was Moshe. Mikan Amru, from here we say, Shei Adam Muchan l'chavad chamav. From here you can learn an important lesson, that a person should really be respectful of their in-laws. In other words, I may have thought the idea of kibbud av v'em, respecting one's parents, applies to my parents, to my spouse's parents. So from this, we could learn by the fact that Moshe is identified by the Mechilta, by the Medrash, he's identified as the one who initiated the bowing, the kissing, and the asking, how are you doing? That indicates to us that it's important for a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law to show real kavod, to show real respect, and to do for his or her in-laws, even though they're not his or her parents, but they're his spouse's parents, so we got to give them kavod as well. Beautiful medrash. Let's see what Rav Yosef Salam does with this. So on the column on the right, Yesh lavin mazeh shesipra lanu Torah sheshalu ish l'rei l'shalom. Why does the Torah go out of its way? We know the Torah doesn't waste words. What's the Torah getting at when it's telling us that one fellow asked the other fellow, how was your peace? How are you doing? I could assume that's what they do. Whenever two people have a reunion, they ask, how are you doing? What's the Torah teaching us by the fact that Moshe initiates asking, how are you doing? And furthermore, that look at what Chazal do here. They have to learn from using all sorts of tricky Talmudic reasoning to tell us Shemosh Rabbeinu Nikra Shalom Shalom Chasno. Ooh, big chiddush! It was Moshe who initiated the conversation. That Moshe was the one, because elsewhere the Torah refers to him as Ish. He must have been the one who initiated the conversation and asked his father-in-law Yisro, "How are you doing?" Why do we care? Maybe it was Yisro who was the first to ask. What is it so special to us that it was Moshe who asked? I understand why it's important to establish that it was Moshe who did the initial bowing and the kissing, because that's l'kavod chasno, because we want to show that Moshe was showing honor to his father-in-law. That's teaching us something. That a person has to show honor to their in-laws. I get it, why it's important to establish Moshe was the one who initiated the bowing and Moshe initiated the kissing. But why is it so important to say Moshe initiated the how are you doing? Maybe Yisro initiated the how are you doing? And I'll still know that you got to respect your in-laws because Moshe initiated the bowing and the kissing. Everyone asks, how are you doing? Two friends get together. It doesn't have to be parent, child, in-law, son-in-law, daughter-in-law to the in-laws. But what's the chiddush? What's the big deal? Why is it so important to establish that, no, don't get confused. It was Moshe who asked first, how are you doing? Why is that so important? I get it why you needed to teach me why it's important that he was the one who bowed first, kissed first, because you're teaching me this valuable lesson that it's the son-in-law has to show, or a daughter-in-law too, has to show honor to his or her in-laws. But why is it so important to establish that Moshe was the one who asked, "How are you doing?" So look at his suggestion. Beautiful. He says it has to do with the laws of converts. Vevshar lafarish. He goes, it's possible to explain as follows. Mishum shemoshe lo nechvaz lekabel es Yisro legerus. Moshe was not so quick to accept Yisro to be a righteous convert. Adasher yachkor, so he wanted to investigate. V'yede wanted to know im amnam bali iskayer l'shem shemayim, is the reason why he wants to join the Jewish people and convert. Is it really for the right reasons? Or is it because right now he's in a really low status? Maybe his kinsmen back home in Midian have deposed him, and there's only one way up. That's by joining Am Yisrael. He wants to know what's the reason he wants to join us. Is it because it's the right reasons, because he wants to throw his lot with the Jewish people, or is it because he's going through some kind of crisis back at home, and this is his way out of it? So it's not really sincere. The Yisrael case Baruma Maila. And right now, the Jews are on cloud 9. So he wants to improve his lot by joining the Jewish people. That's why he wants to join up with the Jewish people. This is what the Gemara tells us in Yavamas. That once Mashiach arrives, and it's so clear that Am Yisrael is on the up and up, we're not going to accept Gerim anymore, because we can't know that converts are really converting for the right reason. Maybe the reason they're converting is because it's so abundantly clear that Am Yisrael has got this special relationship with God. That's why they're converting. But maybe it's not for the right reasons. Also, Gemara tells us that in the days of the ascendancy, when everything was at its zenith, the Malchus Beis David was at its full height in the lifetime of David HaMelech, and in the lifetime of Shlomo, they also didn't accept Gerim. They didn't accept converts because they could never be sure was someone converting for the right reasons. So that's what Moshe was worried about right now. He's nervous. Maybe Yisro is not converting for the right reasons. He sees that we're at this elevated status. Rashi perish Mechilta. So what is Rashi doing? Rashi is quoting from the Mechilta, Mashinemar, by the fact that it says Vayevo Yisro Ela Midbar, that Yisro joins the Jewish people in the wilderness. Don't we know that the Jewish people are in the wilderness? Ela b'shivcho shel Yisro dever akaso. Rashi says, quoting the Mechilta, it's praising Yisro. Shel Yoshe b'chvodo shel olam. He's telling us that at that point in Yisro's personal journey, he had achieved the pinnacle of society. He was at the pinnacle of society back in Midian. The nidvo libo latzes el midbar, and he gave it all up with a full heart to journey, to leave it all behind and go out to the wilderness, makom to a desolate place, lishma divrei Torah, because he wanted to hear the words of Torah. That's what Rashi told us earlier in Pasuk Hey, using the Mechilta. So l'chori yikshal zeh, someone could have a question. Sha'amru shaya yoshe b'chvodo shel olam. Rashi said, quoting the Mechilta, that at this point in Yisro's life, he was at a really honored position. He held a lofty post back in Midian. Is that true? Halo amru b'midrash. The Midrash tells us, and Rashi quoted it earlier, Yisro pirish me'avodah zara, that earlier in Yisro's career he had abandoned idol worship. V'amdu b'nei Medina, and his local countrymen got up, v'nido, and they excommunicated him. Shelo yaslo malacha. Nobody was going to engage in any business with him. V'lo yiru esono. Nobody was going to shepherd his flocks. That's why his daughters were out being the shepherds, because there was nobody who would work for him. He was in total excommunication. He was at the bottom of the rung of society. And even his daughters who were working as shepherds, that's why they were chased away from the well, because of that excommunication. So how do you understand this? That earlier in Parshas Shmos, Yisro was at the bottom of society in Midian, and now we're praising him, saying that he's at the top of society. How do we understand that? How does that make sense? So it says as follows. The daughters were being chased and pursued even by other shepherds. So now how here can the Mechilta say Yoshe b'chvodo shel olam? What was What's with this rise and fall of Yisro? That he once was a Kohen Midjan, now he's at Parshas Shemos, he's in excommunication, and that's why his daughters have to be a shepherd because no one will work for him, and they even try to chase and hurt his daughters. And now all of a sudden comes Parshas Yisro, and the Mechilta praises him. Wow, look what he gave up. He gave up being at the loftiest level of Midjan society to join Bnei Israel in the wilderness. What changed? What happened? Sarach Lomar, so he says, here's how you have to explain Yisro's career. Shemizman Sheba Moshe al Yisro, from the time that Moshe showed up and started living with Yisro, v'yashav imo, and he lived with him, v'ro es gedulaso v'raso Moshe. The locals began to appreciate what kind of a special person Moshe was. They said, whoa, this Yisro, who he had previously excommunicated, he's got an extremely special son-in-law. So they made Yisro a chief again. So meaning, look at this career path of Yisro. He started off as the chief. He gives up idolatry, they excommunicate him. Moshe shows up, and out of respect for Moshe, they realize this Yisro must not be such a bad character. He's got such a chashuv son-in-law, so they put Yisro back in a big position. So last time Moshe saw Yisro, he was back in a good position. By the time Moshe split ways with him. Over Medrash, it says over in the Medrash in Balak, it says, Amr Vayomer Moav al Ziknei Midjan, Matimon shal Ziknei Midjan kan. Why does it say that Moav said anything to the elders of Midjan? Ela shal Yiro es Yisrael notzchin shlo kederech haaretz. They saw that the Jews were winning, and it seems to have gone against the laws of nature. Amr Manik Shalem b'Midjan, Nisgadel, they said their leader, Moshe, he grew up in Midjan, Noda Mehem, Mami Dosav. Let's find out from the elders of Midjan, what exactly is this guy all about? What makes him so special? Amrulem Ziknei Midjan, so the elders of Midjan say, Ein kocho ela b'piv. His whole strength comes from his mouth, and he knows how to communicate with God, and he knows how to pray. And that's the point where they go hire Bilam. Oh, let's get another guy who knows how to use his mouth. Adkan. Mavur Mizah, what do you see from that Medrash? Shemoshe Rabbeinu Kishaya b'Midjan robo gedulos v'neflo she'asu sham b'koch piv. While he was in Midjan, people already there were aware of the fact that he was working wonders using his mouth and through prayer and using God's name. L'kach mitzad pachdam u'maram, because of the fact that they were scared of Moshe, mipnei Moshe, asu shalom in Yisro. So he wants to say this explains Yisro's career. Again, he started off as a Kohen, as a priest and as a chief. He gives up idolatry. They excommunicate him. Moshe shows up. After a while, people begun to realize how special Moshe is. Out of fear, they say, wow, we better show some respect to Yisro again. So they re-elevated Yisro. They made peace with him, re-elevated. Voshivu al kano l'kunaso. And they made him a chief once again. Kamashmos HaKasav Khan. And our pasuk here actually implies that. Shoya Yisro Gamachav Kohen Midjan. It refers to him now as what? He's a Kohen Midjan. He's a chief in Midjan again. Moshe Perish Rashi Shoya Yoshe B'chodo Shalom. That he was really had all the dignity and respect possible. So this is the career path of Yisro. So last time Moshe saw him, he was back in a high station. Ulam Akshav wrote some Moshe Leidas. Now Moshe wants to know, okay, he wants to join the Jewish people. What's going on? I need to make sure he's sincere. Maybe he got deposed again. Maybe they excommunicated him again. And the reason he wants to join the Jewish people is because of the fact that he's down in the gutters. So I got to just double check. Is Yisro, what's his status in Midjan society? Is he still feeling on the top of the world? Are they still respecting him? Or is he back in excommunication? That's what he says. Ulam Akshav Rotza Moshe Leidas. And now Moshe, upon meeting him and hearing that he wants to join the Jewish people, he wants to know why. Maybe since Moshe departed from his father-in-law, maybe they pursued him once again, his father-in-law, and maybe they excommunicated him, so he's back in the gutter. And that's why he's choosing to come to the Jewish people and to Moshe to convert, not because of sincere reasons, because he sees this is my only ticket back to a life of prestige. I've been kicked back down. That's what it's getting at. The Ish asked Re'ehu, what is his peace? And that's why Chazal said it was so important to know who asked who. We need to know who asked who. That it was Moshe, who elsewhere is referred to as an Ish. He was the one who asked Yisro, what is your peace? Hainu, what does that mean? Shisholo. He was asking Yisro, What is your status currently in Midian? Imu chai b'shalom, are you at peace with all your neighbors? Are you still in a position of power? Im bnei amo, bnei medina so, im lo, or not? Have you been deposed again? Are you back in excommunication? Are you being kicked around and abused? Ukishenoda lo Moshe, when it becomes clear to Moshe, shamnam chosano hu b'shalom v'shalva, that his father-in-law Yisro is in peace and he's in good standing back in Midian. V'yoshev gam achshav b'chvod shalom, and he has obtained a very lofty position. He's a chief once again. In Ken Geruso hu rak l'shem shemayim. Now it becomes clear that his willingness to convert and join Am Yisrael, it's not because he's seeking a quick route to prestige, but rather it's totally for the sake of heaven. He didn't need this. He already was at a lofty place in society. He was a Kohen Midjan. He was a chief. So that proves he must be sincere. Oz kiblu v'yavua ola. That's the way the pasuk continues. Once Moshe asked him in Shalom, once Moshe asked him what was his status back there, and he was able to ascertain that no, he was not being kicked around and abused. He was in a lofty position and he still wants to join Am Yisrael. That's when he invites him into his tent and to say, okay, let me help you become part of the Jewish people. So that's what he says. That's what the Mechilta, the Medrash says, when he says he welcomed him into the Ohel. What is the Ohel? Zeh Beis Medrash. He's inviting him into the Beis Medrash to study Torah, to learn, so he'll have the material and the information he needs to be a Ger Tzedek, to be a righteous convert. That's what the pasuk is getting at when it says that the Ish asked his friend, "How are you doing?" Lamdu Chazal, that perished, and that's why Chazal felt the need to learn from this. Shemoshe shal l'shalom chasno. That's why it's important to know. Yes, it was Moshe who was initiating, asking, what is the current situation of the father-in-law of Yisro? It's not just the usual, how are you doing? Rather, he was trying to figure out, Yisro, what's your current status in Midianite society? Where are you holding? Are you back in the gutter? Are you in excommunication once again? Are you in Cherem? Or are you still in an elevated position? Once it's established that he's in an elevated position, so now I know you're sincere. Why did he want to know all this? In order to determine from this whether or not Yisro was his decision to join Am Yisrael, was that really l'shem shamayim? Was that really for the right reasons? It's a beautiful idea. I thought it's a very interesting way to learn the pasuk. It adds a lot more to that conversation and to that interaction between Moshe and his father-in-law. Because again, his questions he started with is, why is it so important? I get it. You needed to let me know who bowed first, who kissed first, because you want to teach me the halacha that a son-in-law is supposed to show covet for a father-in-law. But why was it so important to establish who asked who first? How are you doing? Because he's saying it wasn't just a standard, how are you doing? This was a drisha v'chakira. This was an investigative a process. Moshe wanted to know, what is your current status in Midianite society, in order to establish whether or not his desire to become a ger, his desire to become a convert, was this sincere, and should he work with him on this process? I thought that was very interesting.
Go back and convert all the people.
Yeah, our tradition is that Yisro does go back. The Torah tells us that Yisro does leave the Jewish people. In Parshas Baaloscha, we're told that he does leave. Even here it says that he left, but his main leaving is really in Baaloscha. And the way Chazal, our sages, understand it is he went back to go get his clan, I guess his immediate family, try to convince who he could about this path, and to collect his belongings, and then rejoin the Jewish people. So that's our No, what we do know is that in Sefer in Nevi'im, we find that before Shaul goes to war against Amalek, it says that he first issues a warning to the Kenizi to go ahead and leave, because they lived right nearby them, and it says there that those were descendants of Yisro. So there is this understanding that he was successful in gathering up some members, I don't know everyone, some members of the clan, and bringing them back to join Am Yisrael, and they did dwell. It seems like they kept some type of togetherness. They kept some kind of solidarity after they had joined Bnei Yisrael. then I'm assuming they just assimilated into the Jewish people. We never really hear much of them. Yeah. Well, we also do know that that some of the descendants there are Okay, I want to share a third of our Torah. This third one I thought was incredibly cool. It's weird to say cool, but let's see. I think this gives us a huge insight. I want to share with you this Devar Torah. This is something I found in a sefer of Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Rav Chaim Kanievsky passed away the other year, I believe it was on Purim or Shushan Purim. He passed away. I don't know if it was last year or 2 years ago. I don't remember, but he passed away. He was a heavy duty Talmud Chacham. His whole life was Torah and learning Torah. It was said about him, I don't know for how many years he pulled this off, but he would make a siyum every Erev Pesach, not just on a Masechta, not just on Shas. It was he made a siyum every Erev Pesach on Kol HaTorah Kulam. Basically, he had a system of how much he needed to learn every single day from Tanakh, from all of Mishnayos, from Gemara, both Bavli and Yerushalmi, Shulchan Aruch, and then also Midrashim, and he did everything over the course of a year. I don't know what it was, what kind of a schedule that was. It must have been wild, and you can see from his Sfarim. I'm no expert at all, but you can see this was a man who had absolute mastery of all of Torah literature. And I'm going to show you in this one little paragraph here an example of what type of mastery, as well as humility, and I would say maybe even a sense of humor we'll see in this. So let's see. So in Parshas Yisro, we know that the Torah is given. We have the whole episode of Har Sinai. And the pasuk tells us, "Vahi b'yom hashlishi." So we're in Perek Yud Tes, that's chapter 19. I'm on page 4 in the handout. So it says, "Vahi b'yom hashlishi." It was on the third day. Biyos haboker. It's still morning. All of a sudden there's thunderclaps, lightning flashes. Vanan kaved al ahar, there's a very thick cloud descends on the mountain. The kol shofar chazak ma'od, and there's this very powerful blast of the shofar. And the way Rashi explains it using the Medrash is that usually if someone blowing shofar, the longer they blow, the weaker it gets. And here it's the opposite. The longer it blows, the stronger it gets. This startling noise. And everyone who is in the camp, the entire Am Yisrael, they all begin to shudder. It's a terrifying experience what they're witnessing. So let's see in Rav Chaim Kanievsky in his Sefer Time of the Kra. Now I'm not sure how long ago this was published. I saw a version online. This is what I cut and pasted from. It's been republished many times. I don't know when and what stage in his life this was first published. It would be interesting to know. So let's see what he writes here. The kol shofar chazak mode. If you look at the way the word shofar is spelled throughout this parsha, you see there's a letter missing. There's no vav. That's called chaser, that it's missing a letter, and that's fine because the way nekudos work, if you know how a word is supposed to be pronounced, you can put that nekuda that's to indicate that it's supposed to be pronounced shofar. But if it was malay, if it was filled, it would have a vav there, and it was shofar. So here, Rav Chaim points out, again, this never caught my attention, that whenever it mentions, throughout this whole episode of Matan Torah, whenever it uses the word shofar, it's always chaser, it's always missing a vav. Again, I'm no expert in the Kedushim of Rav Chaim Kanievsky, but when I've looked at his Sefer Time of the Kra, I often do notice this, that he does enjoy darshaning. He does enjoy coming up with explanations or theories as to why sometimes the Torah writes a word as a chaser, missing a letter, and sometimes as a malay. I have seen this several times in his Sefer. He does definitely enjoy coming up with theories, and here he's going to do that. He says, look at his piece. V'kol shofar chazak ma'od, v'chein kaseh b'chol parsha. Shofar, here in this entire parsha of Yisro, whenever it mentions the word shofar throughout the giving of the Torah, chaser, it's always written as a chaser, without the vav. Avol, however, in Parshas Bahar later, Gabe Yovel, when it's discussing the laws of Yovel, the Jubilee year, and there the shofar is blown, and that's when all the Avadim Ivrim go free. So it says, Gabe Yovel ksiv shofar male. Every time it says shofar in Parshas Bahar, there it is male. It is full. It's got a vav. So what's going on? Why is it that here throughout Parshas Yisro, whenever shofar is written, it's chaser, there's no vav, but in Parshas Bahar, whenever shofar is written, there is a vav. So here's his theory. Venira, Mishum dekan lo haya shofar mamash. Because here, who's blowing the shofar? It's Hashem. Hashem is making the noise of a shofar. There's not an actual shofar being used. Ela kol shel shofar. There's the sound of the shofar. God wants the sound of the shofar to be sounded. So that's what Bnei Yisrael were hearing. They weren't hearing an actual horn being blasted. They were hearing the sound of a horn. So to indicate that, ksiv shofar chaser. That's why God in the Torah writes the word shofar chaser, lacking the vav, to let you know it wasn't a real shofar. It was a nace. They were hearing the sound of the shofar. Aval b'makomo shaya shofar mamash. But whenever the Torah wants to indicate that a real, full-blown, tangible shofar was being blown or is being blown, ksiv malay, that's when you'll find it does have a vav. So in Parshas Bahar, when it's talking about mankind blowing the shofar for Yovel, there it's Malay, because it's talking about mankind sounding a shofar. But here in Parshas Yisro, where it's God sounding a shofar, he's not actually using a real shofar, he's just letting us hear the sound of a shofar, so it's chaser. So this is Reb Chaim's theory. And he says that it's a beautiful theory, it makes a lot of sense, and this would explain, go through the Torah, and whenever you find the Torah writes it Malay, it's talking about a real shofar. When it's saying chaser, it's not. Goes Lefiza, it comes out according to this. If my theory is true, it's not just in the Torah, it's going to be throughout Tanakh. So he says it would come out according to this, that in Yeshaya, Chav Zayin, in Sefer Yeshayahu, when he's describing the Messianic age, and it says, D'chsiv yitaka b'shofar gadol. We say this on Rosh Hashanah, V'aya bayom ahu yitaka b'shofar gadol. It'll be on that day, and God will blast on the great shofar, and all the exiled Jews are going to return to Israel. There it's written with a vav. So he says it would come out, if what I'm saying is true, it's going to come out that the Nevuah of Yeshayahu tells us what? It teaches us that shofar gadol, that God's going to blast on the day of the ultimate redemption. Yeah, shofar mamish, that's going to be a real shofar. If what I'm saying is correct, that's how it's going to come out. He says that's amazing. Daksiv shofar male, because if you look in Sefer Yeshayahu, when it talks about that, it uses a shofar written with a vav. So Reb Chaim says this is amazing, and he goes, "This is my theory, and it would come out from this something amazing." And now he says, however, I'm going to show some humility. He says, he goes, I'm familiar. Aren't we all familiar with this? There's one of the midrashim that is not studied so often is Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, and we'll soon see what that is in a second. Sof Perak Lamed Aleph, at the end of chapter 31, he says, you're going to have a problem. He says, I am Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, Sof Perak Lamed Aleph, V'tzarech Ian. He says, here's the problem with my theory. You'll see my theory runs into a problem when you look at the end of the chapter of Lamed Aleph in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. He doesn't tell you what the problem is, but we're going to quickly figure it out ourselves. Let's hit the pause. Oh no, we'll come back to that in a second. And now he just tells you at the end. He writes, "Umatzasi b'Tanakh." By the way, I want you to know I found in Tanakh Od Shisha Makomos, another 6 places Ksiv Shofar Chaser, where it writes shofar without a vav. V'tzarech Sham Tam. I guess those we're going to need a good reason to explain why those don't have a vav. Where it goes, seemingly those are talking about real shofars, and those don't have a vav. So why not? If you're talking about a real shofar, it goes, this is the drawback of my theory. It goes, I've got 2 drawbacks on my theory. One, I run into a problem at the end of the medrash, in the end of Perek Lamed Aleph, in this medrash not everyone's familiar with, in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. And number 2, I found another 6 places in Tanakh that the word shofar, where it seems to be talking about a man-made shofar, a man blowing shofar, it's written chaser, without a vav. And again, my theory was wherever it's a man-made shofar, man-blowing shofar should have a vav, it should be mali. So just first of all, look at the humility. Rav Chaim here is saying that I've got this beautiful svara, I've got this beautiful theory, but I'm also going to be very honest with you. He didn't have to tell us this. How many of us are going to know that there's another 6 places in Tanakh and that they don't fit? You know, he didn't have to write that, but he wanted to share that, to say, I don't want to toot my own horn too. Oh, no pun intended, tooting the horn and talking about shofar. So I don't want to toot my own horn too much, because I found 6 places where this won't work. Okay, he didn't have to tell us. This tells us about his humility, and also how many people are going to call him out on the end of chapter 31 in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer? Who knows who's familiar with Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer? But Rav Chaim Kanievsky absolutely is familiar, and he says, I got to be honest, and look at this humility. But I also see from this Look at the mastery. This again, when people say this man had all of Torah at his fingertips, look at this example of this. He says, yeah, this everyone knows this, end of chapter 31 in Pirkei Rav Elazar. So there's a problem with my theory. Okay, how many people knew that? He knows it. And we'll soon see what that problem is. And also he says, and by the way, there's another 6 places in Tanakh. He wrote this again. I could not find when he wrote his original Sefer of Time of the Krah, but I guarantee you he never hopped on one of the internet searches that searches throughout Tanakh looking for how many times is it that shofar is written that chaser without outside of Parshas Yisro. Yet his mastery of Tanakh allows him to say with confidence outside of outside of Parshas Yisro, there's another 6 places and that it's chaser, and I don't know why it is that way. It's just in my mind. It's just I took a step back when I saw that. It's like realize what that means. The man has absolute mastery of Tanakh, and he's saying this in humility. But what he intended as humility ends up shining a light on what kind of a master of Tanakh he was. To me, that I found that humorous, is that he's writing this to be a humble man. Like, I think this is a nice theory, but look, it's not going to work because there's 6 places in Tanakh where it doesn't. So where he's doing that to be humble, I'm saying, look at what kind of a master he was. How does he know there's 6 places? He didn't have a computer. He wasn't looking at, amazing. Anyhow, what was at the end of chapter 31 in Pirkei Rav Elazar that said it hurts his theory that in Parshas Yisro it's chaser because it wasn't a real shofar. So look what's at the end. So we'll read this paragraph together. Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa Amar, also ayil shenivra ben hashmashos. God, during the twilight hours on Friday, it says in the Medrash that he created an ayil, a special ram that was going to have a special purpose. And that was what was going to be brought as for the Akedas Yitzchak. So he says that ram that God created, lo yatsa mimenu davar levatala. No part of that ram went to waste. Afro shel ayil hu yesod al gabi mizbeach hapnimi. The ashes of that ayil, the ashes of that ram that was burnt by Avraham Avinu on the Temple Mount, that ends up becoming, I guess, the basis of the ground that the inner Mizbeach sat on in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the holiest chamber, in the Beis HaMikdash. It sounds like it's established on the ashes of the ayil of the original ram that Avraham Avinu burnt. Gidei ayil, the sinews of that ram, what became of them? Elu asara nevalim. Those were the 10 strings of the harp, Shal Kinor, the 10 strings of the harp, Shaya David ben Again Bahem. According to the Medrash, David HaMelech had a special Kinor David, the special harp, the stringed instrument that he would use to sing God's praises. It wasn't just strings. He used sinews from that ayil, from that ram that had been brought for the Akedas Yitzchak, in lieu of Yitzchak. Oro shalayil, what became of the skin? Because the skin, it seems like, was not burnt. Oro shalayil, who Ezor Masnav Shel Elio Zikron Bracha. That it sounds like Elio Hanavi, he had a special like leather girdle around his waist. Shenemar Ish Bal Se'ar, so because it's talking about Elio Hanavi, it talks about that he was a man with a lot of hair and he had a girdle of leather around his loins. So what was that leather from? That ayil. Okay, that's not what concerns us. What concerns us is what's in bold. Karnav Shalayil, what became of the horns of that ayil, of that ram that was brought in lieu of Yitzchak at the Akedah? Shall small, the left horn, Shetakabo Bahar Sinai. That was used as the sound of the shofar at Har Sinai. Shenemar v'yibim shoch keren hayovel. V'shal yamin, what becomes of the right horn? Shehi gedola mishal small, which is even bigger because the right horn we say is more chashuv than the left. Shu asil litkoa bo lasilavo. That's the horn which that eventually, when Mashiach arrives, that's the shofar that will be sounded. Shenemar v'ayim bayom ahu yitakaba shofar gadol. V'ayah Hashem l'melech hakol haaretz. That is the horn. So what's the problem Rav Chaim Kanievsky has with this? If this medrash, according to this medrash, both horns of the ram that was brought by Avram as a korban in lieu of Yitzchak were used, are real horns. One is going to be used in Yeshayahu, and that makes sense. Shofar Gadol, that has a vav, because that's a real horn. But the medrash here says that the left horn was used at Har Sinai. If it was a real horn and it was used at Har Sinai, it should have a vav. It should be malay. And Rav Chaim said his theory about why all the word shofar all the time in Parshas Yisro are chaser, not above, is because it wasn't a real horn. It was just the sound of horn, but it wasn't coming from a real horn. But he says, I got to be humble. I got to be honest. According to this medrash, my theory won't work. So again, this is another example of through his humility in an effort to show that, look, I don't want to brag. It's a nice theory, but it doesn't fit with this medrash. In his effort to show his humility, he reveals to us some of his mastery of just being aware of these obscure midrashim and that the rest of us would not be quoting. So I thought this was a very, very interesting insight into Rav Chaim Kanievsky. I love the theory about he's looking for a good theory as to why every time he writes shofar in Yisro it's chaser, there's no vav, but in Bahar it is. He's got a beautiful theory, but he says I'm an ish emes, he's an honest person. So he says here's the two problems I'm going to run into. One, my theory is not going to fit with the end of Perek Lamed Aleph from Pirkei Rebbe Lazar. And number two, I found 6 other places in Tanakh where it's chaser, and it according to my theory, it should have been malay. So he says, okay, it was a nice theory. It's cute. I'll record it. But here's the problems. One day, maybe I'll find answers to these, but let's move on. That's how Chaim did it. But in his effort to show his humility, I think he also showed his absolute mastery of Kol HaTorah Kula. I thought that was fascinating. So with these insights, I'm going to leave everyone today. These are some insights that I hope these Divrei Torah were able to enhance our appreciation of Parshas Yisro, and I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for joining and to wish you a wonderful day and enjoy the rest of the week and a good Shabbos. I'm going to stop the recording and